We're really excited tonight to be joined by Briahna Joy Gray, the former National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign, producer and co-host on the podcast Bad Faith, and a contributing editor with Current Affairs magazine. Thank you for joining us on Breakthrough tonight, Briahna.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is all. I have to say, we've got Briahna Joy Gray, we've got Monica Joy Cruz. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, because we got a great show here on Breakthrough. Briahna, I just want to jump right in here. I want to just give you some facts here maybe about the election and get some of your responses to it. Looking at the results in terms of who voted, where they voted, when we saw the Democrats, Joe Biden, won Pennsylvania, but he actually got fewer votes in Philadelphia than Hillary Clinton. Michigan, same thing, won Michigan, fewer votes in Detroit City. In North Carolina, every majority black county, fewer votes. They lost that state. Georgia, the complete reverse, of course. There's a huge black turnout, a huge suburban white turnout. They obviously win the state in somewhat historic fashion. Looking at some of these statistics and just your general view of the election, what does this say about how Joe Biden ran this campaign, and what do you think it says about how he's going to govern and what sort of interest he will be mainly cozying up to?
Well, if you spoke to people who were familiar with what was going on the ground in some of these states, I think the results seemed a little less surprising. On Bad Faith podcast, we spoke to Michael Moore about what was going on in Michigan the Thursday before the election. And in our last episode before the election, we had a panel of Pennsylvanians, including Akayla Lacey from The Intercept, who had just done a some video journalism talking to Black voters, particularly in the state. And what everyone we spoke to said was that there was a disturbing lack of investment, both by the Biden campaign and a lack of interest or galvanization in the Black communities in those states in particular. Akayla talked to a number of folks who either said they were begrudgingly voting for Joe Biden and were doing so with large pained sighs, or folks who said, I can't vote for the guy because I have friends and family members who were victims of the war on drugs and mass incarceration that devastated so many communities. There is a homelessness crisis in Pennsylvania that was largely ignored. I certainly haven't heard anybody from his campaign speak directly to that issue. Michael Moore said all that Joe Biden had to do. Apparently someone from his campaign reached out to Michael Moore in the ninth inning for advice, and Michael Moore recommended that Joe Biden go to Flint and say on day one he was going to declare it a national emergency and get FEMA funding in there and commit to finally getting the people who live in the state, not just in Flint, mind you, but all across the state, clean water. They declined that advice. So what do I expect in the long term in terms of commitment from the Joe Biden campaign to this community, which was heralded during the primary as the core and the base and the reason that Joe Biden ultimately got elected? Unfortunately, I don't expect very much.
Briahna, I was really intrigued by the conversation you had on your podcast yesterday with Killer Mike, who used this analogy of changing the Democratic Party from within to fixing a marriage, which I thought was really funny. Now, what do you believe is the best way forward for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to really make some sort of change and successfully push forward a progressive agenda that, as you spoke to, is so needed and unpopular? What do you think?
Yeah, I have the utmost respect for the genuine progressives that have done a lot within the Democratic Party to bring light to issues that, were largely just completely unheralded before 2016. Bernie opened the door to and inspired so many people. Obviously, the fact that the squad is now doubling after last Tuesday is an incredibly inspiring thing. And they've been able to change the national consciousness in very meaningful ways. And I look forward to watching what they continue to be able to do. But I also think that we have to consider efforts outside of the Democratic Party. I am very encouraged by the People's Party in the effort to build something that's separate and apart and that is willing to be critical of the Democratic Party in a way that members aren't always able to be, because doing so thwarts their ability to create whatever change they can create on the inside. But there are limitations to that, right? And I think one of the key points made by Killer Mike, and which I've been kind of reiterating for a while now, is that as long as one's vote is guaranteed, it is likely to be taken for granted. We saw an enormous effort to, court the votes of Republican voters. Joe Biden has made enormous overtures to Republicans like John Kasich, offering them or floating them as members of his administration. You couldn't, open a newspaper without seeing some overture to some Midwestern white woman voter, or whatever the archetype is this year around. And there's a reason for that. It's because those are people who don't normally vote for Democrats. Those are swing voters, and they get all the attention. And I think there's no better example of what happens to a captured political party or a captured constituency in this country than to look at Black voters who have overwhelmingly, upwards of 90% of us been voting for Democrats for decades and decades and decades. And the consequence is that, as Joe Biden said over the summer, you basically ain't Black if you don't vote for me. You're considered, it's such a part of our identity. It's perceived to be, voting Democrat is perceived to be such a part of our racial identity that to not vote Democrat is to not be Black anymore. And you see what happens as Black folks speak out and say that they demand more from the Democratic Party. I certainly don't agree with everything or every part, way that Ice Cube has gone about trying to get certain issues pressed. But the idea of having a contract with Black America, the very idea of suggesting that the Democratic Party owes us more in exchange for our votes was met with a lot of knee-jerk criticism that I found to be really disappointing. And unless I think voters realize that there is power in organizing and concentrating one's votes and credibly threatening to withhold it, unless certain concessions are made, that we are going to largely remain powerless, at least in the context of these electoral cycles.
No, extraordinarily well put. And I mean, it seems like that, it hits on one of the key issues that is also so much out there, which is, the suggestion that attempting to sort of aggressively organize around issues that at least, point towards transformative change is somehow guaranteed to kneecap you in the election. They're going to call you a socialist. They're going to call you this. I know you probably heard enough of that for 2020 of any one of us here. But I mean, when you look at what ultimately happened to Joe Biden, certainly what happened in Florida, certainly the entire sort of last 3 months of the Trump campaign, I mean, it seems just completely ridiculous to be saying, well, don't do this or don't say this because they're going to demonize you. I mean, Joe Biden's printing shirts in Florida saying, 100% progressive, 100% anti-communist, and still gets trounced. I mean, it seems like in a way that itself, in and of itself, this sort of fear of red baiting is a losing strategy.
Yeah, look, what's particularly galling about the example of Florida is that there's been reporting that the Democratic Party in Florida actively tried to distance itself from the $15 minimum wage, even though, unlike socialism, it is in fact a very positive aspect of Joe Biden's platform, because they thought it was going to be too radical. And guess what? $15 won, Joe Biden lost. And I think that we have to kind of jostle out of people's minds. It's this idea that doing the progressive thing, doing the right thing, doing the ethical thing, doing the humane thing, doing the people-centered thing is somehow an electoral liability instead of a real boon, right? Because I think that historically there have been some moments, and there continue to be some issues that are more galvanizing than others. And I'm not even talking about defund the police, which is the bête noire of the Democratic Party right now, apparently. I'm talking about some cultural issues. I think both parties have foregrounded to, in some ways, distract from the broad array of things that Americans as a whole agree on, right? So even Bloomberg News was reporting today about how overwhelming majorities of Americans support marijuana legalization. Overwhelming majorities of Americans, according to the Fox News exit poll of all places, 72% of Americans support government-run healthcare, right? You've seen an enormous spiking support for Medicare for all as people have been losing their employer-based health insurance at an alarming rate during this crisis. 12 million Americans at least have lost their employer-based health insurance. The flaws of our system, the vulnerabilities of our system are being made clear in ways that were not as obvious to some of the luckier ones during the primary season. And instead of capitalizing on that, instead of running on the fact that unlike Republicans, a Democratic candidate could offer you a $2,000 a month COVID relief package, or compensation replacement so that you can stay, you don't have to fire employees, or rent relief so that people can stay in their homes and the homelessness crisis isn't exacerbated. These kind of clear line policies that are enormously popular. Instead of drawing those contrasts, Joe Biden ran explicitly on nothing will fundamentally change and basically hit out for the media, for much of the election in a way that really had negative down ballot effects. To the extent that he made a pitch, it was, hey, Republicans, come out and vote for me, Republicans. And what did that do? There was a great deal of ticket splitting, it seems, where Republicans did come out and maybe some of them did help Joe Biden get elected, but we lost seats in the House and so far have failed to gain the Senate, which means that climate change, the Green New Deal, all of the reasons you were supposed to out Biden, even if he didn't satisfy our needs as progressives, our needs as working people, are not going to get passed anyway, right? Because he doesn't have the authority, the power to do so. So it's worth taking a beat, and the Democratic Party needs to be very introspective about whether it wants to continue to forfeit its ability to win, just so that it can continue to appease the corporate donors that fuel that wing of the party.
Right.
I think you're exactly right, Brianna. One thing that I saw in the media recently that just made me chuckle, of course, this whole New York Times piece with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she's alluding to this leaked transcript of this meeting of Democrats post-election, going off about no more talk on defund the police, no more talk on socialism, all of this. And we heard from a representative from South Carolina, James Clyburn, talk about how in all of his decades-long career of being a black politician, he's never known a black socialist. What's your response to that?
I believe when he was giving that interview, he had several black socialists lined up behind him off screen. I can't remember exactly who was in the statuary behind him, but Martin Luther King is a black socialist. He might be familiar with, A. Philip Randolph might be a black socialist. He's familiar with, all of our, so I won't say all, but obviously a large number of our civil rights icons were very cognizant of the extent to which capitalism was a major obstacle toward black liberation, and also the extent to which both the two-party system was an obstacle to black liberation. And I think that's a real frustrating erasure that's going on there. But, look, we talked about this a little bit with Killer Mike on today's episode of Bad Faith. And it's a difficult issue, right? Because there are so many black people, so many voters who, for legitimate reasons, feel a lot of kinship and admiration and respect for people like James Clyburn, who have done a lot and who have struggled and have walked and have protested and marched for Black rights over the course of their lifetimes, particularly in their youth. And as progressives, as leftists, it's going to be a delicate balance to being clear-eyed and honest about the ways in which these people have begun to depart from their legacy, without alienating voters who, know them better than us and, feel a lot of loyalty to those kinds of politicians. So I think Black leftists in particular are going to have to play an outsized role there in shining light on the reasons why somebody like Clyburn, who might have, good wishes in his heart, might be acting in a way that betrays some of the interests of the people who rely on him. And principal among those reasons is the fact that he takes more money from the pharmaceutical industry than anybody else in Congress. And I think it's incumbent on us to really surface that fact and ask voters to make their own decisions about whether or not that might be compromising his ability to speak in their best interest.
I think that's an enormously important point, and even just thinking about the context that you gave of the people who are behind him there. I mean, how important or how relevant is the role of the media and things like this? I mean, I'm sure from your own personal experience, this is certainly true. I mean, it seems as if the way the reporting is done on black politics, that you really only count as a black person when you meet the right tick boxes for the story narratives. Maybe I'm being overly harsh, but it does seem, I mean, if the majority of younger black people were voting for Bernie Sanders or supporting very radical policies, but somehow it's still considered axiomatic black is equal to conservative, I mean, what about the role of the media here?
It plays a very important role. It's part of why I was, eager and happy to come and talk to you both today, because my experience, as National Press Secretary in particular, is that it was a lot more difficult to kind of direct information to Black voters as a group than it was to direct information to Latino voters, for instance, right? Because there is this whole entire separate Spanish language news infrastructure, there is a way to kind of target and direct stuff to an audience that doesn't really exist. There's no Black news channel. There is, BET. There are these fits and starts. There are individuals with platforms like Roland Martin. There's celebrity outreach, but there isn't a channel that Black people can tune into every day and get news that is relevant to our communities in particular. And to the extent that there is representation on mainstream news outlets from Black people, just like the rest of mainstream news representation, it doesn't bear, those people don't have a lot in common with the average experience of a working person of any race, right? And those are not the issues that tend to get surfaced on those programs. So, it's hard. I don't think I've ever seen anyone on television talk about Clyburn's funding base, much less really anybody in the Democratic primaries funding base, except for the viral nature of the Pete's Wine Cave tweets, right? Like if you get a good hashtag going, occasionally you can break through. It was largely sympathetic coverage. There were all kinds of people defending Pete, and it was kind of characterized as a flight of fancy by some ridiculous, childish leftists, and not taken as the credible threat to our democracy that campaign finance issues and corruption really are. It's hard. And that's part of why, we are doing this podcast, why I'm so glad you have this show, why I'm so happy there's people like Tim Black out there, because we're going to have to do a lot more than just talking to our families over the Thanksgiving dinner table. We have to figure out how to, make our voices heard and to resurface our history, our own extremely Black history of radical, frankly not radical, it's just humane, but progressive politics in this country. The history of democratic socialism, of progressivism, of liberation in America is a fundamentally Black history. You can't get every I always joke that so much of the first year law curriculum is just black because they're taking con law. It's about our rights largely. Right. If you're taking property law, you're talking about redlining and racial exclusion practices. Over and over and over again, the story of America is the story of Black people fighting for equality, and the idea that you ain't Black to want to blindly follow a party that has been so participatory in our subjugation is really, really craven.
Absolutely. I couldn't have put it any better. I mean, there's a lot of work to do. I'll agree with you on that 100%. Briahna Joy Gray, co-host of the Bad Faith podcast, also an editor at Current Affairs, and of course, former National Press Secretary for, I'm struggling here, Senator Bernie Sanders. I got it all in there. Many other great superlatives I could add. Thank you so much for joining us here on Breakthrough.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, really.